Welcome to Kentucky Horsepower, the official podcast of the Kentucky Automobile Dealers Association.
Hi, good day, everyone. This is Jason Wilson, President of KADA, the Kentucky Auto Dealer Association, and this is the official podcast of KADA, Kentucky Horsepower, and I appreciate you all joining us. And with me today is no stranger to our audience, and we're very pleased to have Kevin Tynan with the Presidio Group. Kevin, how are you this post 4th of July? Hope all is well.
Doing great. Loving the summer.
Yeah, it's crazy. We've obviously finished July 4th here, and we're already moving through what seems to already be coming up to mid-July and just flying through the summer. And this 4th of July was a little different. I mean, there were a few things that happened, a few things noteworthy, not the least of which is the President Trump signing the big, beautiful bill. Let's go ahead and talk about that. I don't know if you've been out and about speaking to this yet. This all just really happened. So now it's time to sort of unpack some of these things. And I thought who better to help us sort of go through this and what this means in our industry than you. So with that, Kevin, I'll just sort of turn it over to you, get your initial thoughts, and then we can sort of dig a little deeper as we go through it as far as what the overall impacts look like for our industry, car dealers in particular, manufacturers, all the above, but there are far-reaching implications of this bill.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Usually you get to, the end of June closes out the second quarter, and then as an analyst, somewhere around April, May, you're starting to do your mid-year outlook, what the second half of the year is going to look like. Or you get through the July 4th holiday, and you start to publish some of those things and talk about some of those things. And this one is super interesting because what we've known before, and not even just the first half of this year, but
sure,
for the past several years, has the potential to be very, very different second half of the year, especially in the fourth quarter if federal tax credits and some of those subsidies for EVs completely go away. It leaves that segment of the market really, for the first time probably ever, without really a demand lever to drive the consumer towards the technology. And that profile, that dynamic between EV supply and the capacity that manufacturers have put in place and the inventory dealers have on the ground, compared to a very different demand scenario that we've seen basically for a decade plus, changes basically on a dime. And while it may be more organic and finally give manufacturers, suppliers, consumers, governments, media a view of what the true EV demand looks like in this country, there's a lot of parties that can get caught with too much inventory, not enough demand, and
Sure.
It all seems that it could potentially happen almost overnight.
Yeah, to that point, I mean, we're again, and I think you raised a really good point regarding this will be eye-opening to some of the folks involved that has been covering this stuff, that unlike all the other lines, and you've spoken specifically about trucks and where that market is and how that is growing. Now, in a way, this EV market is going to have to stand on its own, so to speak. Right. And we're going to find out if the early adopters were the only adopters, or if this is sustainable at some level. But it really upends potentially a lot of, I would think, the mindset of the OEMs moving forward of what they're going to produce, what they want to produce. As you've said time and time again, they want to produce things that make them money. And that's why the costs continue to go up. That's why it's all heavy truck. That's why we've seen a decline in traditional cars. We've seen those markets dwindle. As we see this sort of change, it is going to be really interesting to see how this changes, especially a state like ours here in Kentucky, where our adoption rate of EVs is under 2% last I checked.
Yeah.
So what does that look like? And also, I like here in Kentucky, where they've Ford's invested in battery plants and throughout the country, OEMs have invested in battery plants. Is that going to hit a pause button? Are they going to pivot? What is that going to look like, do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think what you can wind up getting, and I'm all for that sort of natural marketplace, organic kind of demand
Yep.
supply balance, so I think on the one hand, I wouldn't say like, oh, well, Ford is going to abandon that and write off the
Right.
investment. I don't think that investment has, it's not everything at this point. So I think if there is this more natural demand level that's transparent, right? That's not motivated by government media, right? Or government reacting to media
Right.
and that's really where the demand is. I think it can be okay. And I also think that like there's a legitimate uh customer base sustainable going forward that where EV works for
Sure.
those consumers, right? And I think that's what you'll get is you'll get a pace that isn't forced because our government is saying we have to do this because China's doing it at their pace, right? Our pace doesn't need to be their pace for a bunch of geopolitical reasons. So I think that what you will get is that sort of organic demand picture, and then automakers can kind of align production and output to that and add investment as it's needed, if it's needed, when it's needed, and not be forced to do something that has been proven unprofitable, at least at this level of scale. So I think it'll be interesting in that respect, is that it's not, over. And
Right.
I think it's about that more natural choice where, and I've said this, at the convention, like it's why we don't all drive minivans or we all don't drive two-seater sports cars, right? There's a group and there's a demand pocket that technology will work for,
Right.
and they will go seek it out and they'll find it. And the manufacturers, if they can make money doing it, will provide it. And those who it doesn't work for, like Kentucky, will not, right? And
Right.
that should be the freedom of the marketplace, from the beginning. And I think this will be the first time we'll actually see that, where, the idea of the subsidies and the government, involvement is to let the industry be able to stand on its own 2 feet. And I don't know that it's ever really gotten there, which is
Right.
different than the way China handled it, right? There is so much money thrown at those manufacturers that arguably are well, not arguably unprofitable, but they're unprofitable. And arguably, you're not sure that even that industry can stand on its own, but the government is propping it up. So, it's almost like comparing apples to oranges in the sense that China's EV marketplace penetration is what it is because the government has invested very heavily, spent very heavily, and
Yep.
needed that to happen. Where our dynamics here are very different, and I think it's a race or a contest or a war that I don't think we need to really compete in terms of transitioning to electric vehicles at the pace that China needs to do it, right? They
Right.
can do electricity. They've bought the mines, they've got the infrastructure. They can do that and they need to move their transportation in that direction. Ours is different, so I think it's the first time we're actually going to see, and I think it relieves a little bit of that financial pressure so that automakers who have invested in the technology can develop it in the ways and at the pace that works for them.
Yeah. A couple things there. Obviously, one, yes, China has definitely put their thumb on the scale regarding where they need to be from an EV standpoint. But as you look at this bill, HR1, the big beautiful bill, and you think about the implications that we just spoke of, and then you go back just a couple weeks where the president signed regarding CARB and what that looks like, and that has been now put in check. It really, if you're in the EV business and the only EV business, right? It looks like it could be a very challenging landscape moving forward for the Teslas, Rivians, Lucids, etc.
And it,
If
it
you're looking
already
at those,
was.
what are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, and it already was challenging, at least financially, from that
Sure.
perspective for those automakers. Look, and I showed that slide at convention, look, Ford Model E, Rivian, Lucid, never have not made a profit.
Right.
Most of them at the gross line, never mind at the operating line, right? So there's a long way to go for profitability. And you say, well, they never really reach scale. Well, this isn't going to make it any easier, right? Because anytime they tried to scale output, they didn't have the demand to match it, even with the subsidies, right? Even with the federal tax credits and the requirements on emissions and fuel economy, they still couldn't get there to scale. So that's why I think that this is going to be an interesting time where if this market is left to its devices of where it's going to go naturally, that business unit for Ford and those manufacturers at Lucid and Rivian are going to struggle, although they're doing good work, right? It's good technology. It's a product that has probably niche demand for now.
Sure.
Could it ever be, a high single digit or low double digit market share companies? I'm not sure. But there's a place for it. I just think that this next 6 months or 6 to 12 months is going to be really telling on, whether this continues at what pace, or is this kind of failed experiment saying, hey, we have enough demand for maybe one of these companies, right?
Yeah.
And maybe it's Tesla. And for those pockets where EV works, that's the only game in town. But as far as adoption, widespread adoption, I think it will take a lot longer. And if it's not financially viable for the manufacturer, then it's very difficult for that to happen, right? Because what you're saying to a manufacturer is do this even though you're going to lose money. And it's like, well, how do we stay in business unless the government says we have your back, which is very difficult to do here, at least in this country. It doesn't work, right? You
Right.
can't, that's not a business model.
Yeah. The other interesting part of this whole thing, and some of the maybe some of the unintended consequences of this thing, uh, and why I think it's so consequential as it relates to especially the undoing of CARB and what that's going to look like, losing of these incentives and everything else. That EV was the tool that OEMs were using to get in, to use as a wedge item for that direct sales piece, right?
Yeah.
And without all those additional features to help support that endeavor, does it not make the franchise system and having that reach much more attractive to whether it's like a Tesla or others, but more importantly, as we're looking at VW Scout, as it comes to mind, or Sony and Honda from that standpoint. Do you see this as something that maybe gives them pause as far as going down this hole that they're already being challenged? I mean, my friend Brian Moss in California taking suit. There's a number of other things in process. If you're sitting in those offices, if you're in the C-suite of those offices, are you really looking at this landscape and thinking, maybe we need to revisit this and go a different way?
Yeah, I mean, there's at least two sides to that coin. One is the direct sales model, at least in my mind, was always, I don't believe it works at scale.
Right.
Right. So there's the one thing. But then on the other hand, you're saying, well, you may never achieve scale anyway. Right. So the question becomes like, well, we're only going to sell so many of these per year, which again is going to be a difficult business case to have in the first place. Then you say, well, it's not really a threat to anything because we're not selling that many. And we should just fold it into so if you, on the one hand, if you don't have the scale, how does it make sense as a profitable business? Right. So then you say, well, I don't really want to do it. But then on the other hand, you say, well, we're not at scale anyway. So who are we really hurting by doing this? And I think it'll be a difficult case to make it will be a more difficult case to make to say, we are going to do direct sales without scale, because now you're talking a couple of units. And while it's easy maybe to deliver a couple of units and service a couple of units, it just seems more trouble than it's worth, because now you don't have, like you said, you don't have the dealership, you don't have the physical location, bring the vehicle here. We have the expertise to fix it. Right now, you're sending flatbeds to everybody's driveway where, it's not, again, it's not a great business model. It doesn't make a ton of sense. So my feeling would be that if you're expecting that those companies and those EV direct sellers are going to have a very hard time achieving scale in the first place in terms of volume, then it doesn't necessarily make sense to be a direct seller. We talked about this at convention, that unsold inventory is on your balance sheet now, right?
Right.
Because you don't have a franchise base to sell it and book that offsetting revenue. So it seems like, well, why do that then, right? If you're going to have a hard time delivering vehicles because you're direct, and now you're going to sit with all that money on your balance sheet. And I think I showed it at convention, where Rivian has in finished goods inventory, as much on the balance sheet as they do in revenue in a quarter. So if you think about that, if you were to book that revenue as soon as you produce it, you would double your top line immediately.
Yep.
Right. So even from that perspective, it's a lot of money, even though it's a small relative to a GM or a Ford or a large global automaker. But for those companies, it's you would double your revenue overnight by selling selling through franchises. So
Right.
I think the lack of scale makes it difficult for, now for Scout, right? On the one hand, they're saying we're not part of VW, but you do, if you have that financial backing of VW that says, well, you can carry that inventory on your balance sheet because we have your back. Well, then it short circuits the we're independent argument anyway.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
This big circle. So I think the lack of scale or the ability or the inability to achieve scale will be, forget, and I'm not even getting into the legal fight of it.
Right.
From a business model perspective, to me, it never made sense to go direct, just for those financial reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that's clear is there's a whole new set of headwinds now that all of these EV dependent companies are now facing that they haven't faced before. In fact, it was the opposite. They were being incentivized. They were being pushed to produce these things, consumer incentives, et cetera, which I know you've often said, and this goes to many of our past conventions, to our audience, is OEMs aren't in the business to lose money on building vehicles. They don't want to do that, which makes sense.
Well, and the other thing too, and I'm always sort of balancing that more harm than good. And if you're a VW or you're a Honda, is it really worth aggravating your franchise dealer base that has been there for you for decades and is your source, your direct line to the consumer? Is it worth pissing them off for these couple of EV units? It just doesn't make sense to me, where, I'd have to believe that, especially if you're not going to achieve scale, that falls on the more harm than good line, right? Like that's over the line of, like, especially Honda, who has really good relationships with their franchise dealer base.
Yep.
Why would you even put this out there? And VW, which has a little bit more tenuous position in the US in terms of market share, is saying,
yes,
like, okay, so the people who actually do volume for you, that's the ones that you're making angry by doing this, or these couple of units that you might sell in this new brand. It doesn't make sense from that perspective, other than to say we're this high-tech sort of Tesla-like rival because we sell direct and they sell direct, and that gets us some sort of brand equity or market capitalization or something like that. But to me, for those couple of units that you might sell in Scout or anywhere else, to anger your dealer base, to me, just doesn't make sense.
Well, and look, I'm gonna take a moment here, because one of the things that fires me up is, specifically as we talk about, and to your point, Volkswagen, which is in a bit more tenuous position, is with regards to market share in the U.S., is this notion that somehow it's a better service to the consumer to be able to offer us direct and everything else. Let's not forget, it was Volkswagen who was involved in one of the biggest scandals in the history of automotive. And it wasn't that long ago. I mean, for those for those with any kind of memory whatsoever, I think we're going back to 2015, 2017 timeframe, Dieselgate, which was again, that was a workaround to suppress the emissions, to purposely evade and avoid by the manufacturer. And yet we're going to say this is the best thing. We have the consumer's best interest at heart and everything else, lest we forget. And this is where I get a little bit of my soapbox regarding the benefit of the franchise system and having that dealer that interfaces directly with the consumer versus this vertical process
Faceless.
of distribution. I mean, it makes zero sense, and that's what's so maddening to the dealers from the standpoint is, hey, you put us through a really bad spot. We helped you through this time and had to be the face of it, and now here we go. One can only hope that with the change in landscape here, maybe that will allow an off ramp or a pivot by some, but I still think OEMs are always going to try and pursue that direct model, whatever it is, because they still feel that they can do better, or they like that direct option and want to be able to pursue it. But it just seems nonsensical.
Yeah, and if you think about it, right, when the whole diesel scandal happened, and a couple of things about that. One is, right, so you're not a U.S. company, so you're a German company in the first place who's caught cheating. So now you're this German faceless cheating manufacturer, right? That is going to sell that your process is going to be better for the consumer, which is bizarre, right? And to your point, so the dealerships help rebuild that image. The other thing, though, I always say is that for years, Volkswagen was all about, you want diesel in the US, and I don't know that it was ever going to get them any kind of market share growth.
Right.
And it's like they kept hammering, you want diesel, and we're going like, no, we don't, not really.
Yeah.
And then the scandal happens, and it sort of knocks them off the diesel platform and to the EV platform. So it was like, your scandal on emissions created your opportunity in EV in the first place, right? So
great point.
And I still say, if I look at it like for Volkswagen, it was, I don't want to call it a blessing in disguise, but it finally got them to realize that in the US, diesel was not the way forward, and they had to do something else, right? And they jumped on the EV bandwagon. And you got to remember too, because of that scandal, that changes Mercedes and BMW's drivetrain strategy in the US also, right? Because again, even if we don't want EV to the scale that Europe thinks we do,
right,
or European manufacturers think we do, right? As a global automaker, you want to share as much technology and platform as possible, right? That's how you absorb costs. And so if you have to go big EV because Europe is making you, and you can sell them in China, or at least you can try and compete in China, well, it just naturally follows that you have to send them here, right? It's just part of the process, whether we want them or not. This is what we have. This is the product we're going forward with. And I think to the earlier point, I think that's one of the things we're going to see in the second half of this year and into 2026 is that, you had European automakers, BMW, Volkswagen, Mercedes, who had to go heavier on EV. And now if that sort of reversed, they're a little bit more of a rug pull on them than there would be on the domestic manufacturers. The other one that kind of went heavy into it was Hyundai Kia, right? So there's a lot of product on the ground that is like, oh, we're not sure how this is going to look, and they had their different motivations for it. But the European manufacturers are in this little bit of a spot because globally, those are the products they've chosen to do, where our domestic manufacturers have stayed more to the, internal combustion or hybrid and pick up an SUV base. And I feel like that this is starting to show in the numbers that we've seen in the first half of the year in terms of volume gains and in terms of inventory. Granted, there's still some import brands who just can't ship product because of the tariff uncertainty, but I feel like it's getting back to that organic market that says, no, we're fine with gasoline and SUVs and pickups here, and these are the brands that have them, and that's starting to reflect in some of the mid-year numbers, at least at this point.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll make mention of is the fact that you also have emerging technology considerations, right? Regarding Toyota, just talking about their move to really pursue hydrogen as an option. So as things evolve there, that too will sort of play a part in this, I would suspect.
Yeah, and I think that's like the thing that I'm sort of thinking about now is, about the China, and I've done a bunch of China discussions and talked to smart people on the topic, and and it's interesting to me, and I feel like that technology stuff, whether it's hydrogen, whether it's EV, right? I just feel like we can do it, we should do it, but we should do it at the pace that works for us and our
Right,
market. I feel like we're being pulled into a fight, a technology fight against the Chinese. That one, everybody tells us we can't win, and two, I'm not sure is necessary. Right?
right,
We can do it. We can do it at our pace, but I feel like we're being pulled in so that they can just, you know, pummel our auto industry and move in and take over. Because, right, the only two places where it isn't is the US and Canada, right? It's everywhere in Europe, it's everywhere in
right.
Asia, it's everywhere, China especially, right? And you're constantly seeing it. And I've talked to a lot of people that even when you look at EV or battery electric vehicle and Tesla in China, like how quickly they're getting lapped on technology, and not just electric vehicle technology, but also autonomous driving. Like what Tesla
Sure.
does in their vehicle, people who are in China manufacturing, like every one of our manufacturers is beyond that already. So their pace of innovation is so much faster because it has to be, and that's where they're spending. And I feel like if we try and jump in that fight without the supply chain in place, without, the mining and materials and all these things, we're getting caught up in a fight. One, we can't win, and two, isn't necessary here at that same pace, right? They
Right,
can do, they want to do, they've built the infrastructure to do electricity. And it makes sense for their transportation base to go in that direction. We're not the same here, right? We can
right,
still do petroleum. We can do those other things and we can keep pace. But even if we're not going to do it at as fast as China is doing it, somebody was telling me, one of the large automakers is filing 45 patents a day on battery tech. Like it's just a fight that everybody says we can't win. And I'm saying, like, well, why do we even have to get involved in the first place? Why can't we do things at the pace that it works for us?
right.
And so I think that's probably what we'll hopefully see, going forward, is that, yeah, we're going to do it and we're going to do it well, but we're going to do it at the pace that works for our market, and it happens organically and it happens profitably, which helps it happen. And because short of the government, the way it happens in China, short of the government pouring money into the advance in technology, right? It has to happen at a more logical pace,
Sure.
right? Where if you're gonna, go back in time to 2009 when China really started pushing electric vehicles, their investment, direct subsidies to their manufacturers, are something we would never do.
Right,
If it's $40,000 per vehicle to an auto, like, we would just never do that here. So
right.
we can't innovate at that same pace. We're not going to be protected against those losses in the same way. So it's just it's a fight we can't win, and I think we're being suckered into getting into the fight in the first place.
Yeah, no, very good point. And obviously, the ramifications of this bill we'll see now play out in real time. It's been passed, and we'll see how this shakes out. Hey, last thing I want to touch base with you as we are approaching mid-July, and I think last time you were on with us, we talked quite a bit about tariffs. Seemingly, early on, you heard from the media and others that the sky was falling, that this was chaos, and we're driving into an recession, and this is going to be all those things. Well, fast forward, and here we are again approaching mid-July, and those things haven't happened. But as this thing continues on, and there have been some deals that have been announced and waiting on specifics, things of that nature, how do you see this playing out a bit, moving forward here throughout the summer and beyond, if this continues. Again, thus far, not really an impact that we're seeing, although I saw just this morning, we're seeing a little uptick in pricing on used vehicles. I suspect that will continue. But how do you see this sort of shaking out? Look in your crystal ball and tell us sort of what you see on this.
Yeah, and I feel like I've been consistent in this message, which is, look, tariffs, no doubt about it, are inflationary
Mm-hmm.
because they constrain supply. Now, the difference is, and look, COVID was supply constraint as well. The
Yep.
difference was it impacted everybody because it was global supply chains. The other thing you had during the pandemic period was you had government stimulus for the consumer. Interest rates were considerably lower.
Yep.
There were stimulus payments, and so the consumer, and the other thing too is that we didn't commute and travel the same way, right? So
Right.
where everybody was remote, you didn't have that same gas bill or that train and subway bill, right? So there was a lot of catch up in repair and maintenance or even purchase of new vehicles. So demand stayed reasonably stable through that period, even though it seemed like the world was ending. Um, so this is different in that it is supply constraint, but it's not supply constraint for everybody. More
Right.
the import brands or the manufacturers who don't have a lot of production here. So, and I think that's where you're starting to see the domestic brands with a little bit of volume uptick. But again, I still think that anybody who's waiting for lower prices is not going to happen, right? It's not going to happen where an automaker gets a couple of 100 basis points of margin and is going to pass that along to the consumer or invest it in a $25,000 platform. And I mean that from every automaker, including Tesla, who talks about a $25,000. Now, that's not to say it can't happen. It just can't happen profitably. So an
Right.
automaker can choose to do it, right? You could sell anything you want for any price you want. You just have to understand that it's going to lose money and you would have to have some other motivation to do it, whether it's a government subsidy or whether it's just we want access to the entry level market, the young buyer who we think we can move up through the portfolio over the next 40 years or whatever it happens. But profitability is not going to be that motivation.
Right.
So, and we've talked about it a ton. Like I don't hate a smaller 15 million unit market at
Yep.
solid transparent transaction prices
Yep.
that are profitable for the automakers, right? And it'll come back around where there will be some automakers that will satisfy the bottom of the market, or the pre-owned market will offer price points there. But there'll be ways for manufacturers and their finance companies to get people into new or used vehicle. You know what I think is happening too a lot is, and this is just my own sort of anecdotal, I think what's happening is you're getting, for the younger and move up buyer, they're getting the hand-me-down, and then the more affluent maybe the parent is getting the new vehicle, right?
Sure.
You take my 5-year-old whatever, for a reasonable price, and I'll go get the new thing. My credit's better, my
Right.
insurance rates are better, I have more money, I'll go and do it, and then you have my other thing. So there'll be ways to satisfy that part of the market, but it won't be because automakers see an opportunity there. There's a volume opportunity there. There is not a profit opportunity there, and there probably never will be. Everything is inflationary all the time, and
Sure.
that is going to reverse, So, dealers, and we talked about this at convention a lot across all the conventions, was that if your domestic brands, whether it's CDJR or Ford or GM, don't expect that there's that sort of, I mean, there are the products, and one of the dealers said to me, I can sell Chevrolet Trax all day. I just can't get them. And it's like, yeah, well, because they lose money for the manufacturer. So they're going to
Right.
control how many they put out there
Right.
and just sort of offer a taste and get people into the brand. But, if you're booking a loss, you want to control how many of those things you actually sell. So that's, I think, going to be the view going forward. And then you're going to have maybe it's the Asia-based brands whose cost structure is more flexible and lower, that they can get people in at in the 30s or in the
Sure.
high 20s. But again, not profitably, but they like to be able to move people up through that portfolio. And I showed it in the slide. Even Toyota's starting to move out of that competitive peer group where Nissan and Hyundai, Kia, and Honda are, and starting to move up in terms of transaction prices. Not quite to where the domestic brands are, but they're certainly creating some white space between them and the other Asia-based competitors.
Yeah, all great points. And Kevin, I appreciate you referencing our convention. I'll remind everyone, a number of you saw Kevin speak at convention. He spoke at every Kentucky convention since I've been here. He'll be there next year. Another reason to come to KADA Family Convention is you get great content like this. And Kevin has a way of breaking this down in great detail, but make it so we can all understand. And that's one of the things that we appreciate. Kevin Tynan, thank you for joining us today. We'll continue to kind of watch, assess, and revisit with you as the months and the year goes on, and see how things shake out here post big, beautiful bill and all the things that the far-reaching implications thereof. So again, thank you for joining. This is Kevin Tynan of Presidio Group. And to those watching and or listening, this is KADA's Kentucky Horsepower, and we'll see you down the road.